Welcome back to the fourth half. That is the second half of the second class on this discourse on Shankara that we're all engaging in, and looking at his spiritual brilliance. And we had just left off in the first half talking about his first vision of Divine Mother of the Universe, and she granted him from there on Brahma Drishti, that is a vision of Brahman, constant perception of reality everywhere. Going about that way, it's one thing to have acquired these different levels and to enjoy them, 7 levels of knowledge at different times in different spans of your day or month or life. But to have this constant perception of Brahman is, of course, only granted by someone as powerful and omniscient as the Divine Mother of the Universe. After that vision, he went to Varanasi. He left Varanasi. He went to Badrikashrama in the Himalayas, attending all the mountainous holy pilgrimage places as he did. And he offered worship to Ram and Sita, to Shiva and Parvati at Devaprayag, where we've been once on one of our tours. And just finishing up this whole youthful teacher kind of phase to get into this onerous duty, you might say, came at him to have to debate with beings who were holding not just low views, sometimes even evil views, that like animal sacrifice had begun to be done by certain sects, and any darshana can fall. Even Samkhya was not being taught right. So he went and began to take up in different townships along the way, talking to and debating with, if necessary, these beings that were holding these views on different systems, because Buddhism had abandoned the field at that point, and now there was a lot of competition vying for what the people should be worshipping now and looking at and hearing from the priestcraft and so forth, priest class. So first he had to defeat tantricists in debate, because they were offering sacrifice. They were even bridging on human sacrifice at that point. It had gotten so bad. That was at Uttarakhand, which is near the Himalayas there. And he came on the scene with his way of being, which we can only kind of imagine, but maybe a short description of it might help, how he carried himself. Most remarkable thing was his age. He was only 12 or so. A divine radiance enveloped his whole being. He struck everyone as being the very acme of monasticism. His disciples were, by physical age, all older than him. Coming to learn about his arrival, a huge assembly gathered at every town. Brahmin pundits, aspirants, large numbers of beings flocked to have a look at this brilliant young Acharya. His tireless exposition of the truth on the non-dual Brahman, the contents of the Vedas, charmed every listener. The incomparable celestial charm of that boy monk, the divine glow of his childlike countenance, beaming with the bliss of Brahman realization, his 2 eyes effulgent with indrawness and subjective absorption, his severely pleasant form, and above all, the extreme sweetness of his demeanor and character filled the minds of all with amazement on one hand and delight on the other. His listeners and pupils were much senior in age. This was one of the most striking facets. But the boy monk, by his clear exposition of scriptural contents and by the great force of his personality, immersed and nourished in the profound experience of Brahman, was able to completely free everyone from doubts and fill all minds with contentment and satisfaction. Quote the hymn to Dakshinamurti. This indeed is wonderful. Under a banyan tree are seated aged disciples before a youthful master. The master sits, and by his eloquent silence dispels all doubts and disciples. Emanating knowledge of the Supreme Brahman, most eminent of the Acharyas, surrounded by hoary-headed devout aspirants, giving out the knowledge of Brahman, holding the symbol of Jnanam in the palm of his hand, was the very embodiment of bliss, satisfied in the self, eyes closed. To that Dakshinamurti image do I adore. And more about that from this stotram. So you could see how he came amongst people, and the debate wasn't really much of a debate in most cases. From the descriptions we have, is more just an overcoming by this peace and this bliss and this youth that came from him, and no errors in his philosophy whatsoever, and able to explain himself in terms of the sutras on Brahman, and pull from any source he could to make his point most convincing. Other things he did in that period was he located lost images, mostly of Vishnu, and he himself would sit and meditate at a certain temple, and then he would tell people, go dive there in a nearby river, because that's where the Buddhist priests had thrown these images, and they were against that image worship that was going on. And so people would dive for these images and find them where he looked at the past and saw where they'd been thrown. He himself occasionally made dives to retrieve them when no one else was able. It was at this time, at a young age, he finished his Bhashya on the Brahma Sutras, his commentaries on the 12 Upanishads, and his commentary on the Gita, as well as the Vishnu Sahasranam, the 1,000 names of Lord Vishnu. And these he taught to his disciples. So he was simultaneously giving out the teachings of these scriptures and writing his commentaries on them at the same time. That was at Keshavapurayag, which we didn't visit. Sanandana became Padmapada. That was, we sang one of the verses about that in Govinda, Bhaja Govindam, by walking on water to assist him. Now it was a story on that, but I think maybe we need to take less stories and move along with this outline of his fivefold life. His missionary phase began at Jyotirdham. The ruler of the area employed scribes to spread his teachings far and wide. It was one of the things he did with his convincing ways, was to also change the minds of kings, get them on his side, rajas they're called, and other great leaders of people, and win them over by his expositions on the Brahma Sutras and the teachings. He also renewed teachings to householders based upon restoration and worship of the 5 deities. That's pretty much why we have those 5 main sampradayas right now. Basically, Shaivites, the Vaishnavas, the mother worshippers, the sun worshippers, and the worship of Ganesh. Those 5 he brought out and for the households and said, this is the 5-fold seat. He called it the seat of the Devi, but this is the 5-fold seat, asana, of the 5 kinds of worships you should be doing in the temple. So basically, Shiva, Vishnu, Ambika was the favorite Divine Mother image. Surya, the sun god, who, as we know, teaches so nicely in the Akshi Upanishad about light. And then Ganesha, the elephant-headed god. All of these 5. And along with these 5, he brought out another 5 called the 5 sacrifices. Basically, Deva Yagya, Rishi Yagya, Pitru Yagya, Nara Yagya, and Bhuta Yagya. You probably remember those from earlier teachings we've had in SRV. You worship the gods, which of course he's been having them do by doing these keeping in mind these 5 deities, your family line came out of those deities. Usually you came out of, if you're, like Sri Krishna, his family is worshipping, Krishna, so based Vaishnava kind of thing. So that was a whole line of families coming out of that. Some are born into Shiva families, Shiva-oriented, and some into others. So the family line is to be honored and followed based on whatever particular deity you choose to worship in single-minded fashion. And then Rishi Yagya, doing sacrifice to the teachers. Yagya means basically a kind of sacrifice that you do daily to them. And then Pitri, to the ancestors. Nara, to mankind overall. And Bhuta, to the animals and insects and plants and so forth. Objects, Bhutas. All of these 5 he brought back forth. So the 5 deities and the 5 yagas, he was bringing these back to the householders, basically, as he was at the same time doing all the rest of this that he was doing. And convincing kings and debating with philosophers and pundits. And he finally then did his pilgrimage to the Ganges when he was up in those prayags, those junctures of the river. Basically, he started doing his march to the source of the Ganges, where some of us have been, and we've gone to India too. And at the source of the Ganges, he composed a hymn to the Divine Mother, and a beautiful story about that too. Maybe we can take some of these stories if there's time at the end. And then came his debate with Vedavyas, who was, of course, long past. So how was that to happen? So the only way I could say that's kind of an inner miracle, because some of us in the West, we know through Christianity and Jesus and so forth that there are these outer miracles that go on. But the inner miracles about spiritual life have to do more with consciousness, that if you meditate on your teacher, then your teacher can actually kind of take you over. The teaching of that in yoga, because Govindapada was the father of yoga and his guru, is that when a teacher like that's alive on earth, he makes sons and daughters out of his disciples, so they become his actual spiritual sons and daughters. And then they too can begin to imbibe the abilities that he has or she has to give to other disciples that are beginning to come on the scene, which was the case at a very young age for him. So Vedavyas disguised himself as an old Brahmin, and means basically took over the consciousness of that being and just filled it with his essence, and came before Shankara. And then Vedavyas wanted to see if he was competent to write these commentaries, wanted to test his ability, how deep it went. And the story is there, but I think within several days, or some 10 or 12 days debate they went through, friendly debate, like, going on, quoting from scripture and all that. But within a few days, Shankara said, "Oh, I know who you are." So he was able to divine that it was Vedavyas there in that body. And so Vedavyas was like, caught off guard in a way. He'd been discovered. His disguise had been ripped off. And so there's a whole beautiful part of his life in that period near the Ganges where that happened with him and the father of Vedanta, Vedavyas. These other ones, we just no time to get into them, but they're very interesting. When two great leaders in India at the time were Kumarila Bharata and his wife Ubaya Bharati, and Mandara Mishra. These were pretty much Samkhya yogis, and they were preaching Samkhya Yoga as the highest thing. It's like, because Upanishads and Veda were not at a very high level when Buddhism came along, so they kind of panned and people kind of forgot the importance of them. There were not a lot of knowers of Upanishads around at the time. And in fact, it's, Vedavyas himself comes back to do that many lifetimes in a cycle, to keep up the Vedanta. And Krishna says that in the Gita, of these darshanas, I am Vedanta, and of leaders of darshanas, I am Kapila. So these philosophies and these seers that bring them are all very important to the maintenance of high-minded philosophy, especially leading up to non-duality. So some of these pages, I've got my notes here, like, some of these stories are 8-9 pages long, so it's not something that we'd want to read. I think in one case that he was challenged by a Samkhya yoga teacher, maybe it was Mandara Mishra. He said, if you can beat me, and if your Advaita can beat my Samkhya, then I will burn myself. I will slow burn myself in rice husk, heated rice husk. That might have been Kumarila that did that. I'll have to look back and see myself, but basically Shankara did defeat him, turned him and his disciples into Advaitas, and then Kumarila wouldn't give up his vow even though Shankara released him from it, and he slow burned himself in a big pile of hot rice husk. It doesn't burn very fast, I guess. It's just, very hot, but it's not like, flames and that kind of thing. It smokes, and so these are some of the things that happened in Shankara's amazing life, and some of the things he had to witness. Shankara had this debate with Ubaya Bharati, which was, I think, Mandara Mishra's wife, and Mandara Mishra got defeated. But Ubaya Bharati came and challenged Shankara and asked him about teachings of erotic matters. And so Shankara had no knowledge of, especially at his young age and being a sannyas and a monk, had no knowledge of erotic matters whatsoever. And so he was caught off guard. He was out-debated, and about the union of Shiva and Shakti, how man and wife live together, producing children, all of that. Monks don't know about those things. And in fact, if you go to them and say, "Oh, well, we're thinking of having children," they'll say something like, "Go see your doctor. It's not my province." So Shankara went back that night and meditated and entered the body of a king who had wives, and saw what the experience was like without having to do it. Went back the next day and explained it to Ubaya Bharati and won the debate. So these are things, questions on sexuality and all of that. The art of courtesanship, which was very noble in a sense then, and very high. Wasn't like prostitutes in a Western city or something like that. It was all at a different level because the Tantra was about. The Tantra was happening, and has a lot to do with that. Using the 5 M's, they call it, to prepare a person for enlightenment. So that was a period in his life that was interesting during this young debater and commentator, writing the commentators and debating with these yogis, Samkhya yogis, tantrasists, people who championed Madhava, dualism, people that were totally into Ramanuja at the qualified level. He would take them all on and prove the superiority to Advaita, and he did it. There was no question that he didn't do it. Nobody doubted him. Everyone who debated with him lost, and they admitted that they lost. And so this is how he brought back the Vedas and Upanishads, plus that strand of Advaita Vedanta at that time, I guess, like I said, set up by the presence of Gaudapada and Govindapada, and also behind that, you might say, Vedavyasa. So Mandara's wife, she buried her husband, a funeral service, and then she became his disciple and took monastic vows. She became a sannyasini. So this is like what happens in the life of a great soul like that. So spiritual campaign comes next. In that, several points that we know about, because of course Shankara lived a long time ago. He went to the Panchavati temple at Nasik, and that was where Sita and Ram had stayed. And so everyone in India still knew that this was a holy place for Sita and Ram, and he rebuilt that temple that had become in bad shape. So he was thinking that far back as well as current and far ahead, that he would think about the old avatars and make sure that these places that they were associated with it was like sort of what the Ramakrishna order has done in Calcutta and places where Swamiji visited. That some of the places we've gone to in India, either all the way up into Mayavati. But what they did with places that were associated with Master and Mother, Swamiji and the direct disciples, they're doing that right away in the lifetime, though. Shankara was resurrecting this from way back. So that was one of the things he did. And he had spiritual visions during this time, wrote hymns to Paduranga, and he had to defeat the Kapalika sect in Sri Shaila, spoiled the evil plans of their head of their order, who wanted to cut off his head. And so Shankara said, yes, we can debate this. You can have my head. You can cut it off my shoulders if you can debate with me and prove your point. And this was an evil sect. They happen in all religions. In India, this was, of course, not a very good time for philosophy and religion. So, of course, he defeated them and didn't have to lose his head, which is a whole story of about 10 pages on that. Ugra Bhairava was the name of that horrible sect leader. He visited Gokarna and worshipped and composed hymns to Shiva and Parvati there at Gokarneshwara. And at Gokarna he met and defeated the great Shaivite scholar Nilakanta and converted him and his disciples to Advaita Vedanta. Probably was not that hard to do, since he himself came out of a Shaivite sect, Shankara. But his sect, of course, was inclusive of Tantra and inclusive of Shaivism, inclusive, probably based on Advaita Vedanta, with Gaudapada as his teacher's teacher. So there are even then schools of Shaivism, his own darshan, as it were, that he had to go to and update them with this knowledge of Advaita Vedanta. He worshipped the mother, Ambika Devi, on the way to Mukambika, and that was where he had this incident in his life where he like Jesus, brought a soul back to life, a dead body back to life. That was a child. He did that too. Brought a child back to life on his way there. He himself challenged to debate the scholars of the Shardapit, which is the seat of highest learning in India at the time. Interesting name, Shardapit. But he gained victory over that entire assembly. He cut them all down with his exposition of Vedas and Upanishad and Advaita. And then he was asked to become the head of Shardapit. So, I mean, this speaks for itself in a way. I mean, you can't just walk into a city and become the head of Shardapit, the highest center of learning in a country, It's like Swami Vivekananda going to Harvard, and when they heard him speak, they wanted to offer him the highest chair of religion there in the department. And of course he probably accepted it, but didn't occupy it. But this is kind of what it was for Shankara to walk into Shardapit there and defeat everyone, and then ascend to the at the time, unoccupied throne of Sharadapit. There was no high teacher there that was considered to be of ultimate learning. So he became that. He became the Acharya of Sharadapit in his life. It's just almost unthinkable for somebody in his teens. And then there's the story of Hasta Amalaka. I've brought that out in Nectar of Non-Dual Truth for SRV and told you the story several times about the young Brahmin boy who couldn't speak, and as soon as he saw Shankara, said his first words, which turned into a stotram of some 10 or 11 stanzas. And we've put that out as we're able to sing that, and sometimes I draw from it. I've left off the music in this particular class so that we could get to through a lot of these teachings of his life, and which, by the way, now we're into this spiritual campaign section with these last few things I've been telling you. So he spent his time bettering the spiritual lives of all people around him on all levels, and he did this by teaching sadhana chatushtaya. So here's another great facet of Shankara's teachings that we get: the these four fruits, 4 jewels and 6 treasures are sometimes called, or 6 treasures and 4 jewels, depending on how you want to put that. Viveka, Vairagya, Samadhamma, Upariti, Titiksha, Shraddha, and today say Samadhana, Upariti, Titiksha, and then ending with Mumukshutvam, a desire to be free, a true desire to be free. This is how he dealt with people in India who needed to be schooled again in how to walk a Vedanta path in their mind. Because if he set up all the 5 deities and he set up the 5 sacrifices, this is all you did, this was your karmas, it's the karma kanda portion of Upanishad. He kind of caused people to remember that, how to worship, how to do sacrifice, and who you're sacrificing to: men, gods, ancestor gods, and rishis. And taking care of nature all around you. But along with that has to come some ability to practice. And so then he also brought that back. I mean, Shruti, Yukti, and Anubhava, yes, but also brought back then along with that probably the only semblance of a practice that you can extract from Vedanta is sadhana chatushtaya. Otherwise it's just all a statement of truth. And you're supposed to sit there and Shravana, Manana, Nidijasana, and you don't have to go anywhere for that, but sit in one place. I think when he was taught Hatha Yoga, he was taught 3 basic postures to sit in order to do Shravana, Manana, and Nidijasana. So Govindapada checked his posture, not for what we think of today as Hatha Yoga and how people are doing it for what reasons, but he wanted him to have these postures so that he could sit for long periods of time, like Buddha did under the Bo tree for 49 days. Why? To prove something? To be a master of an asana? I mean, what is that physical level of things? So that he could sit and do Shravana, Manana, Nidijasana and teach it to others, to his disciples, and along the way show them how to attain sadhana chatushtaya as the overall mental, intellectual, psychological practice of the mind. Because the mind, everything came out of the mind, he knew that. So then you have to make the mind admit that first, recognize it, pratyabhigya, and then admit it. And then after that, you can withdraw it from that. You see, with the prana, using the prana. So pranayam, pratyahara, dharana, jnana, samadhi, you don't really mess with those in Vedanta. You don't one-upmanship them in yoga. In Vedanta, for yoga, for the sake of yoga. He met Giri at Sringeri, And Gita became a famous disciple. He wasn't able to understand the scriptures like the other disciples around Shankara, but he gave Giri the grace of the Guru, and Giri attained sudden realization of all knowledge. So this is the grace of Guru, God as Guru, and that's why he became Totakacharya. We saw him here as one of the heads of the mat. So this unlettered, illiterate, as it were, person who couldn't understand the scriptures became one of the four main disciples of Shankara, that he invested him with his grace and left him at one of these cardinal places. And I've sang a verse of him before, maybe just to cast a musical note into this, this flow of words for the last 2.5 hours. Kamam krodam lobam moham chakvatmanam bhavaya koham atmagyana vihina mudas te panchayanti karanala guda bhaja govindam mudhamate samprapte sanihite kale nahi rakshati dukrin karane geham gitam sahasram Jaya Shri Pati Rupam Ajasram Deyam Sajana Sangle Chitam Deyam Dina Jaya Chanana Vicham Bhaja Govindam Mudhamate Samprapte Sanihite Kale Nahi Rakshati Dukarin Karine Bhaja Govinda. Just 2 of these 30 verses. I told you last, or sometimes 31 or 32, depending on if you look at the 14 original disciples or the 16 attending disciples. We don't know exactly what happened, but we saw them adding verses to this all the time. But these verses by Totakacharya and others would relate like this: be done with desire, through with anger, finished with grief, and free of delusion. Kamam krodam darpam moham. It's out of the Gita, really, that he got that. That's a teaching by Sri Krishna. Be done with them. And make this one effort called self-inquiry. Who am I? There are fools who, devoid of self-knowledge in this life, like captives, simply torture themselves in hell. So this was the look that these great souls had after seeing Shankara's example, looking inside and watching other people come to him and get defeated in debate or get re-instructed in puja and worship and lineage and scriptures, exposed to revealed scriptures. And so that leads on to this next verse. Read the Gita, recite the Sahasranam, meditate daily on the form of the Lord of Lakshmi, lend the mind always to holy company, and distribute your wealth accordingly amongst the poor for good causes. So he's like putting 5 or 6 practices right in that one. One is the discrimination, as I was just saying, about the scriptures, and manana, how to bring those forward and remember them. So, studying the scriptures, reading the Gita, reciting the Sahasranam, his chanting the names of Vishnu that he made that beautiful commentary on that we were going to look at, or we looked at as one of the scriptures, and always keeping the mind in holy company and so forth, and doing that sacrifice, like giving money to good causes, is a kind of Nara Yaga kind of thing. So these are the kind of thoughts going through the minds of these direct disciples of his. Some of them, like Sureshwaracharya, unsurpassed in knowledge. But then you have somebody like Giri here, who had none of it when he came to his teacher. And you may say it was one of his great miracles. They say Latu, was one of Sri Ramakrishna's great miracles in that way. Came from a province next to Bengal, and just came to Sri Ramakrishna kind of unlettered and simple, and just Sri Ramakrishna turned him into one of his greatest disciples, as if you could do that with unwritten paper. It's like an unwritten book. Open your pages now, and I'll put all these teachings on the pages of your mind, and release you, into a mat as a leader, and you can transmit that to others. It's like no samskara is there to worry about. So one of the ways in which the Lord works, as they say. So Padmapada, one of these other disciples, this is all about his spiritual campaign, so we have to put in some teachings and some stories about Shankara's disciples. Remember 12 apostles of Jesus, and pretty much the 16 disciples of Sri Ramakrishna in this time books can be read by them or about them. So Padmapada decided he wanted to go on pilgrimage. If you're with Shankara, it's like, hey, what the hey are you going away on pilgrimage for? He's the pilgrimage spot. Go with him if you're going, But he wanted to perform penances for, these souls are always wanting to do austerities. Because he thought he had offended something, offended Shankara. So he said, I want to go on pilgrimage, you can't talk me out of it. And, I want to make up for what I've done here. And so Shankara told him, to live in the company of the Guru is the best pilgrimage. The water that washes the Guru's feet is the only real holy water. Seeing your chosen deity in the Guru is the real vision of God. Living near and attending upon the Guru is real service rendered. Sleeping near the feet of the Guru is real rest and repose. Do not go away to far away places and leave the Guru ever. That's what he told him. He wanted to go on pilgrimage. You have it all right there. You remember Holy Mother saying, what do you need an avatar for? Your Guru is greater than an avatar. Just learn at his holy feet. There are other great stories about Padmapada, like taking poison and living through it. And they all did this. It was a very great relationship between Shankara and Padmapada. So, in the time we have remaining, there are two things I want to accomplish. I want to bring this 5-part display of his life to an end. As far as we can go, because we could have read a lot of stories and things, but I'll leave that for you to look up if you want to. But towards one point at Sringeri, he said, it became known that he was teaching. All of a sudden, he tasted mother's milk on his tongue, so he knew his mother was dying. I mean, these are some of these things that really tuned in souls. You probably could call this part of omniscience. But, because you just use the word, it seems kind of fanciful and sometimes unbelievable, but there are signs of connections between people and between things, between worlds and so forth, that if your consciousness is very heightened and sensitized, that you will interpret life by them. And this is what's called precognition, and this is what's called omniscience, and so forth. It's not understandable to ordinary people, although sometimes these things happen to ordinary people. But they just usually aren't able to read them right, if at all. So he took off because he knew his mother was thinking of him and wanted him there at her bedside for passing. So he arrived at her bedside and granted her a vision of Shiva by touching her. That was her chosen ideal. But she had the vision of Shiva on the deathbed and all of a sudden cried out, and Shankara said, "What's the matter, mother?" She said, "Shiva's attendants are horrible, make them go away." because Shiva's got demons and, basically very, lunatics, and his disciples are crazy, weird, and that's just one of the things. Ghosts, spirits, disembodied spirits, are all said to be the demons and attendants on Shiva. So when she saw the vision, it sort of corroborates and verifies that she was actually having that vision, that Shiva was there, but she got really put off by the vision of his attendants. So then he showed her Vishnu, and she gained her salvation into Vishnu. So this is the flexibility of a soul that can, like we were just talking about Tibetan Buddhists, tulkus and rinpoches, being able to guide souls after death to various places if they can't just merge in the Buddha light, which would be nirvana or samadhi, then could guide them to certain places if they're on hand. They're looking, my subtle body has made contact with your subtle body, let's forget the physical and all this around us. Wives, children, please leave the room. You have to focus now. You're passing from the body. So this is how he helped his mother gain realization and taking salvation in Vishnu. In some of the times he met these kings, these rajas, they were always attended upon by evil ancestors. I shouldn't say always, but quite often he found them attended by evil counselors and evil ancestors wanting his money, wanting power. This was happening too in the worldly circles of India, especially at that time. Because it's also in India where we find these really great kings and queens that it's maybe not that hard to find amongst people who have power, like say in the West. But in India you have at least a lot of those, but he would have to go amongst these people when he went to these cities, because if you're a sannyas and you go into a township or a city, they hear about it right away, and the king sends his men, and you have to go see the king. It's like time to go and to show that you're a real sannyasin, because the kings listen to the sannyasins. We don't listen to our holy people here, if we have any. They're just kind of put aside as incidental, if not worse. So when he would go to these townships and these little fiefdoms, you might say, and he'd see the shape of how the king was under the influence of different people, and he'd put things right. So he had a kind of a, like Vivekananda, had a way of diplomacy with people in power. That's a world leader has that. And so this is one of the facets of his spiritual campaign that came out later, and that he could do this too, as well as everything else. And in India, you had an accent. It's not like any of us could hear the Vedanta and know the truth and go speak to someone in power. It's probably not going to happen. You can't even get an audience, and even if you did, they wouldn't listen. But it wasn't the case in India. They had the Dharma back there somewhere, and you just need to remind them of it. So, like in Kerala, when he went home, the king there was having this problem. So the king asked him, once he was convinced that these things were awry, the king asked him to help settle matters in Kerala and resurrect the Dharma there, and gave money and this is where Shankara started coming into land and money, that he would put his dhams, his pitams, his spiritual centers, mats on, because otherwise how can a sannyasin have this kind of access to wealth to be able to do that? So when this got around, then he was able, other kings started giving him, other rajas started giving him rupees, lots of rupees, to make sure that his mission was accomplished, because he would set things right with evil diplomats and politicians. He would make sure that they got exposed, and the right things, the dharmic things, began to happen again. The adharmic things would go away, just like Krishna says in the Gita. So it was there in Kerala that he was asked to stay by the king. That was King Rajeshkara. requested Shankara to stay on there in Kerala, and so Shankara then began having his disciples come to him, and they did. Just by that time he had set them up in different mats. So this was like more toward, his late 20s, early 30s, and he passed away at 32. So this all started happening, and kind of up until his passing, which is another great story we could tell, but covers the 5 levels: his early life, wandering monk, disciplehood, and useful teacher, master debater and commentator, and the campaign he went through. And so if we ever want to take up Shankara again, like next May, we could do that. We could set this up so that we could bring out more facets of his life. But of course the teachings are very important too, so that's why I put this up for the end of the class, is to show you in the scriptures how he would summate things and make teachings available to everyone, from kings to pundits to householders, and to untouchables even, that he had lots of contact with, and who taught him a lot of lessons. Some of the stories about running into untouchables, were amazing, because he would be following a certain etiquette about it that's supposed to be there in India, and then it would be the Divine Mother who had sent this untouchable to him to teach him some sort of lesson about who am I and the body, and who's an untouchable and who isn't, and especially the Atman can't be touched, and it's not going to be made impure by anyone. And both the untouchable and you have that same Atman in you. So that's where the teachings of who's going to vilify a gem fallen in excrement. If a gem has fallen in excrement and you see it there, you probably stick your hand in there to get it and wash both off, and come up with the gem. But the gem was never lost any of its value just because it fell in excrement. So that's kind of the idea about moving amongst what they call patita pavana, the fallen and the lowly souls. That the avatars have to be able to do that too. And they'll learn some of the greatest lessons, like when we interviewed Mother Teresa, some of those stories about working with people in the gutters of Calcutta and in Africa and so forth, how she learned so much. Once she had her vision of Jesus because of a dying Hindu man she was cradling in the street. She looked at him and all of a sudden she saw Jesus there. So her own ideal, her own Ishtam came through that old Hindu man who was about to die. So these kinds of experiences happen to the enlightened, and Shankara was no exception, and there are many beautiful stories about it. But in the remaining time, which is just say 20 minutes, we can look at, take a little closer inspection of the Vivekachudamani. Now when I read that several times in my life, my last reading, I was amazed at what happens in 50 slokas. So what I did was, because there's over 200 slokas in that scripture, so you take just the first 50, and it's just like a reading of basic Vedanta 101, if you could call it that. We know Vedanta cuts very high, even at the 101 kind of level. That fundamental Vedanta is very powerful. But so that's why I put this chart on this chart. What happens in the first 50 slokas of the Vivekachudamani, so that we can all, become aware of that and be amazed, if you want, and maybe trace it to his spiritual brilliance, how he can be talking to a disciple, because most of his scriptures were in the form of Guru talking to the disciple. That was his favorite mode of putting out a scripture, like Krishna with Arjuna and the Gita and so forth. It's one of the favorite modes of India. And then, of course, you've got Ashtavaka Samhita and Avadhuta Gita, which don't follow that so much. But usually it's some seer talking about what they know and being taken down by someone like Vedavyasa and Ganesha, breaking off his tusk and dipping in ink and writing everything Vedavyas knew. So Ganesha was his scribe in the tradition. So if you read these first 50 verses, it goes from bottom up. Basically, you have here human birth, and this is actually even sung in some of these verses of Bhaja Govindam. You'll see that there are instances of them speaking it in this way. So human birth, he would say. I probably won't get to this because we've already done one secret of the scriptures, but let me quickly here read you that top quote of this, because this pertains. The revealed scriptures and spiritual preceptors of the world have their existence through the Atman. Faith, devotion, and constant communion with the wise, these are declared by the scriptures to be the seeker's direct means to realizing truth. So here is where he brings out this facet. It is hard for any embodied being to achieve a human fourth, strength and purity. Basically, that's right there, first three. More difficult still is the desire to live a spiritual life. So once you've got these three, and maybe some of you know that, how can I keep my spiritual life going now? That's what you need to do. And a lot of people fail that hurdle. They just fall down there. They say, well, I know enough. I got a human birth. I'll just enjoy it. And, my mind is okay, and so forth and so on. And I'll just enjoy intellectual acumen and so forth. But to keep spiritual practicing going on to enlightenment, that's a different thing. So more difficult still is the desire to live a spiritual life. And hardest of all is cultivating an ability to comprehend the scriptures. So it shows you how Jnana Yoga in the scriptures is put on such a high level that Jnanam is beyond yoga even. It's beyond practice. It's the truth declared. And this is why Jnana Yoga is such an important yoga. Not only just Gaudapada, Govinda, and Shankara line, but the Ramakrishna lineage since they've showed up on earth and put India's scriptures into so many different languages now. Not just English that we see on their bookshelves, but so many different languages. I was in Japan in the 80s, and I met the two little Japanese couple there at the ashram of Swami Siddharthananda, who was putting the gospel into Japanese. He showed me the manuscript. Oh, we're about 2/3 done with this. So I knew that I went away from Japan on my way to India, knowing that back there in Japan, the gospel was being put into Japanese with Swami Siddharthananda and two of his close-in Japanese disciples. This little Japanese man and woman are so sweet. And they sat me down and fed me Japanese food with the, I slept in a little kind of sliding bamboo room, and it was just all Japanese, but Vedanta was there. So all these different languages, these great scriptures have been put into for so many people to imbibe this. It's just like a worldwide phenomena that fits the description of Vedanta as an underground river. It's making its way to the surface, and people are becoming transformed by it, and nobody can stop it. First of all, not many people know about it. Second of all, they don't know what's coming at them in the form of resurrection, in the form of purification, in the form of transformation of society from the ground up, from the outside, from the inside out, what's coming their way. And so we're asked to be patient. The avatar comes, and then like a steamship, the waves come after it passes. Bye. Have a good journey to enlightenment with the avatar. But afterwards, these waves come and hit against the shore. And surfers are out there, and so forth. So that's all the transformation that happens after the fact in the case of these great souls. So I want to read that so that it introduces nicely into this, which is called the 8 strata of attainment to spirituality, I'm calling it. So in the first 50 scriptures, he starts talking about human birth first, Manushyatvam, I think he calls it in Sanskrit. So you must have a human birth. Where it's not like we want to get into any debates or anything with people who want to stand up for animal rights or who like to manage plants. It's all in our Bhuta Yagya that happens. Look at our Bhuta Yagya. That's what we're actually sacrificing to these beings, these life forms. So don't come to us with that contention. We're talking about if you want a spiritual life, you need a brain stem, and you need a nervous system that can carry prana to it. You need good food. You need holy company. You need all these things in order to get beyond your human station. I mean, you must have gotten beyond your animal station, right? We hope. Although people aren't acting that way. I mean, the Tantra gives out these teachings about pasu, and virya and daiva. There's animalistic people there, and then there's heroic people, and then there's divine people. So it would be a matter of good debate with Shankara to ask him what that teaching really means. What do you mean by pasu in Tantra? What's that mean? Do you mean animalistic people who are worldly, or do you mean devotees who still have animalistic tendencies in us? See, because that's part of what Bhaja Govindam is based on, that scripture. Is that this is to be given to certain people who are still practicing yoga, but jnanam is different than yoga. If you have jnanam, truly, you'll hear it once and that'll be it. You don't have to practice yoga. So these are two classes of beings according to Vedanta. Those are three classes of beings according to Tantra. How does this work together? You see? So, taking up a lot of time when we have none, but this is how important each one of these 8 strata is. And you don't want to get caught in contention about it. Get a human birth, keep a human birth, and then you can transcend the human birth. Isn't that the purpose? You don't want to be reborn here again on earth with the sense objects and the possibility of falling into samsara and the suffering of the 6 transformations and the 8 fetters and so forth and so on. Those of us who have come to higher philosophy, we have a purpose for it. Again, it's back to the teachings of keeping your mind on enlightenment. That's part of manana, right? You keep your mind on enlightenment. You heard the truth to get to this enlightened stage. Don't forget that. And keep that always at the forefront of the mind. Well, strength of body is important. So probably look at Vivekananda's teachings for that. He's looking at his own people and he called them a nation of dyspeptics when he looked at the Hindus. He told them, well, America might be all that great in some ways, but get out there and play football like they are. He and Rakal, Swami Brahmananda, used to wrestle together when they were in lower school in India. Before they met Sri Ramakrishna, they were classmates, so they like get in wrestling matches and stuff. The strength of body was really important to Swamiji because you needed that for spirituality. It wasn't for the purpose of beating people up or whatever things we're doing with muscular physiques and powerlifting and various things we get sidetracked with. You're preparing yourself for strength so you can resist the onset of karmas that are coming your way as soon as you say the Lord's name or as soon as you sit like this. I think asana is just something that you play around with. And when you sit in Padasana asana or any of these, that means you're asking her to come up your spine. That's why most people don't sit this way. They don't want her to come up the spine, subconsciously. Because then they're going to have to work. They're going to have to rise to a higher goal. They're satisfied with lower goals. So you want to raise up Ambika, get a vision of her, and become your true nature, then this is why you do, graduate the strata. The third one is purity of mind. That's pretty low, third. I put that like up at 8th, or 7th, But what he means by purity of mind is morality and ethics and dharmic living and so forth. The real purity of mind, that's something very valued by luminaries. They won't give that away for anything. It's sort of like peace of mind. You just don't give that away for any reason whatsoever once you get it. So Sattva Shuddha, they call it. Fourth is the will to live a spiritual life. And, he says that up here in this quote. It's very hard to do that. And it's sort of like Holy Mother saying, you can have a human birth, and you can have a good teacher, you can have a desire to be free, but if you don't have the friendship of your own mind, those three won't do any good. Well, you can say pretty much this here. If you don't take it deeper and see that spirituality is the way to enlightenment, and keep that as your goal, your penultimate goal, then all of this is almost for nothing. You end up with a strong body and human birth, but you could take another human birth with another strong body. But you didn't graduate and ascend to the purpose of your life and fulfill that, which is what? Comprehension of the scriptures. That's been main facet of these two classes on Shankara. He was very serious about that. Vedanta is very serious about that, and sometimes people just pan that as if it's of no use or value to them at all. It's unfathomable that people think that way when the secrets are there and that. You'll meet the mother through the words by pursuing her scriptures. It's just all the way that you look at it. Then, of course, there's that very powerful viveka. That's the discrimination between the real and the unreal. That develops later on. You probably hear it in the scriptures, and you think, wheat and the chaff, God and mammon, prakriti and purusha, the jivatman and the paramatman. There's so many ways in which you can understand viveka at a very high level. So, sure, Swamiji is walking India calling himself Ramakrishnananda as a monk name. But he found out that Shashi liked that name, and had taken it back in Calcutta, or wherever he was at the time, down south. So he said, okay, I'll call myself Vivekananda. I hear that the West probably could use a good dose of discrimination between the real and the unreal. So I'll go in front of them with that name. He decided that before he went to the Parliament of Religions, to call himself that. In a sense, what does it matter what a monk calls himself? He's beyond names. So this is a very important sixth step, or strata. Then perception of the Atman in union with Brahman, seventh and eighth. That was probably almost covered by, understanding the four levels of knower of Brahman and the 7 stages of knowledge. I've got 2 or 3 other charts on this. One of them is called 7 stages of knowledge plus the 7 stages of lower knowledge. Jnana Bhumika and Jnana Bhumika, which is back to Lord Vashishta's teachings. The lower knowledge are, sleepy. You're just in sleep. You're in a sleepy dream of suffering, and you can't move, and you don't even know that something exists called yourself, or that you don't know your true individuality yet. Everything is a mixed bag. So these are very high strata. Just suffice to say that much here. As I put around it at this time, I put around some facets of Vedanta, and I'll go through them like a whirlwind here. The 3 great boons, I just mentioned those: human birth, able perceptor, and a desire for free. The 5 causes of lack of spiritual success. Oh, and beside, these are in the Vivekachudamani, in the first 50 slokas, most of them. So attachment, delusion, failure to awaken spiritually, failure to awaken, taking refuge in spouse, wealth, and offspring, and obsession with work and activity are the causes for your lack of spiritual success. Can he be any clearer? And if you look at these, a kind of amalgam of yoga, tantra, and Vedanta, because, like I said, his lineage had them all there, with Shaivism too. 8 solutions for lack of spiritual success. Does a great teacher just criticize you and say, oh, too bad you've fallen on hard times, and not give you the way out? No, he shouldn't So renounce cravings, sounds Buddhistic, then struggle, self-effort, punch your way out of that paper bag. If a pigeon is grabbed by the beak, he struggles to get away. Refuge in path and preceptor. Refuge means 100%. I take refuge at the feet of the Divine Mother of the Universe. May she bless us and protect us eternally. Right out of the scriptures. Absorption in love of truth. Devotion to discrimination. This is how Shankara answered people who said, too much jnanam, no bhakti in you. You see, he said, well, my devotion to God is devotion to discrimination between the real and the unreal, because if you don't have that, you're just making a caricature out of bhakti. We see it happening all the time, in all religions. Do you really love God, or do you love the world and you're just pretending to love God, putting on a good face? If you have devotion to discrimination, viveka, which is at a very high level again, then you know you're on the right track. And freedom from worldliness. Those are solutions to the lack of spiritual success listed in these 5. You see how he's doing it? These are all appearing in slokas in the Vivekachudamani, but I put them in the order in which they occur, next to the 8 strata that they occur in. 5 signs of spiritual success: right action, correct discernment, knowledge of reality, non-reliance on physical and moral postures, practices, and the will to practice, too. You have to drum that up out of you somehow. Oh, I don't know if I want to do that. You see. Sit down, shut up, go inside, I'm tired of your ego babble, psycho babble. Just sit there and do it. See what comes up. You'll be happy you did. 5 qualifications for knowledge: illumined teacher, intelligence, desire to learn, capacity, and the power to reason. Now go this way, back down here and up. The 4 qualifications for seeking Brahman: discrimination, desirelessness, tranquility, and longing for freedom. The 4 treasures and the 6 jewels. Those are the sadhana chatushtaya we were just discussing minutes ago. Discrimination, detachment, peace, self-control, forbearance, contentment, concentration, faith are the 6 jewels, and then desire to be free, mumukshutvam. A name of one of my favorite swamis I met in the Ramakrishna order. This name called himself that. Then, as we reach our last minute here, 4 qualifications of a teacher. Guess what? We already looked at them. Okay. So, versed in the scripture, live a pure life, desires only realization for you, and is a knower of Brahman. And then the 5 attributes for approaching the Guru. Do it with devotion, humility, love, desire to serve, and then inquire into reality. So butter them up, set them up. So because your whole spiritual life depends on your teacher. If you don't please the teacher, that's not going to be good for your spiritual considerations. What you want to achieve, your aspirations. So you make sure that, and that's pretty much just right out of the Gita. What is it? Pratitam Priveya Payan, is it? Oh yes, Tad Vidhi Pranipatena Paripashena Sevaya service, Upadekshanti Te Jnana Jnaninas Tat Padarshinaha, and so forth. Approach the teachers and learn from them via these 5 things. And finally, the 3 great sources. You'll end up with the revealed scriptures, an illumined preceptor, and direct spiritual experience, which is back to our here see be chart, right? That we looked at. How important that is to arrive there with a full understanding in all points listed there, so that you can ascend the 8 strata of spirituality according to Shankara. So, if he can put all that in, say, 50 slokas, with a few of these probably scattered around later slokas, and you can see what you can see his spiritual brilliance. We should end with that. Then you know Shankara's spiritual brilliance, because even now, 1300, 1400 years later, from his great life at that time, he was able to give all of that back to Mother India that she had began to forget because of falling on hard times. And it's still current and should be brought back into vogue, if you want to use that word, today, and especially for aspirants who are calling themselves by the noble name Vedantists. So here I think we've run out of time, so we will end with a chant. Om Sato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Joytir Gamaya Mrichor Ma Amritam Gamaya Abir Abir Mayeti Rudrayate Dakshinam Mukam Tenamam Pahi Nicham Om Shanti 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 Hi. Lead us from lower truth to higher truth. Lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from the illusion of death to eternal life. Reach us through and through, O Lord and Mother, with thy sweet and benign presence. Om, peace, peace, peace. May peace be unto us, may peace be unto all. Om, Hari Om, Hari Om, Hari Om Tat Sat.